Billionaire CEO shocked. As twins expose stepmom's secret, what he saw under the bed changes everything. She stood trembling, her breath catching as the contract slipped from his hand. "You knew the rules." Ethan's voice was cold, his jaw sharp beneath the weight of betrayal. 6 months. No feelings. No mistakes. But Grace looked up, her eyes shimmering under the Manhattan skyline, refusing to break. "I never planned to fall for you," she whispered, voice quivering. "But somewhere between your cold heart and my broken promises, I did." For the first time, his perfect world cracked. The ruthless billionaire who never allowed anyone close was now standing face to face with the only woman who dared to love him. Without permission. And as the cameras flashed outside their penthouse, the world was about to find out. This wasn't just a contract anymore. Grace stood there, fingers tightening around the strap of her worn leather bag. Every breath seemed to echo against the glass walls, and every step felt heavier as she crossed the marble floor. Outside, Manhattan glittered like 1,000 dreams just out of reach, but none of them belonged to her. The elevator doors opened with a quiet sigh, pulling her into the place where her life was about to change forever. Behind the cold glass desk sat Ethan Caldwell, billionaire, CEO, and a man known more for his ruthlessness than for any trace of warmth. He didn't even look up as she entered. "You're late," he said flatly. Grace swallowed hard, steadying her voice. "I'm 5 minutes early." He glanced at his Rolex. "In my world, that's 10 minutes late." The words cut sharper than necessary, but she held her ground. She had no choice. The hospital bills piling up on her kitchen counter didn't care how uncomfortable this meeting was. Her mother's life depended on what happened next. "You said this was a temporary administrative position," she reminded him, trying to control the tremor in her voice. He finally closed the folder in front of him and looked up for the first time. His dark eyes held no emotion, only calculation. "I lied," Ethan said, his voice as even as his expression. "I don't need an assistant, Miss Whitmore." Her stomach twisted. "Then, why am I here?" He slid a folder across the glass desk toward her. Inside were pages of legal contracts, a non-disclosure agreement, a prenuptial agreement, and a neatly organized list of appearances, events, and expectations. "Need a wife." The words hung in the air, cold and heavy. "You, what?" she whispered. "You heard me." His tone didn't waver. "My grandfather's will requires me to marry before my 34th birthday to maintain control of the company. Public image matters. Appearances matter." Grace's heart pounded. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. "I don't understand," she breathed. "Why would you ask me?" "Because you're perfect for this role." His voice was calm, disturbingly logical. "You have no ties, no scandals, you're discreet, and most importantly," he paused, his gaze piercing hers, "you're desperate enough." Her throat tightened. Of course he knew. He knew everything. The debt, the eviction notice tucked in her purse, the 3 jobs she juggled to keep her mother alive. He had researched every inch of her life before she even stepped into his office. "Do I even get a choice?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You always have a choice," he said, with something that almost resembled a smile. "But choices often come at a price." She stared down at the papers, at the rows of neatly typed zeros beside her name. It was enough to pay for every surgery, every treatment, every last bill. Enough to save her mother's life. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the pen. She was signing away her freedom, but she was also buying time. With a breath that felt like falling, she wrote her name on the line. It was done. 2 months later, Grace stood in front of the grand floor-to-ceiling windows of Ethan Caldwell's penthouse. The world outside sparkled like diamonds, but it felt empty, like all of this belonged to someone else. She had traded her old life for designer gowns, chauffeur-driven cars, charity galas, and carefully staged smiles. Everywhere they went, cameras followed. Flashbulbs burst like fireworks. They smiled, held hands, played their parts perfectly. But when the lights dimmed and the doors closed, they were strangers again. Separate bedrooms, separate lives. At night, when she couldn't sleep, she'd hear him working in his office. The quiet click of his keyboard, the soft rustle of papers, the low murmur of phone calls that never seemed to end. Sometimes she'd catch him rubbing his temple like he was carrying a weight even his billions couldn't ease. He never let anyone close, not even her. And yet something inside her recognized that loneliness, because she carried it too. One night, after another endless charity event, they rode home in silence, the city lights streaking past the car windows. Grace couldn't take it anymore. "You always do that," she said softly. He glanced at her. "Do what?" "Notice everything, even the way I clench my jaw." Ethan's voice lowered. "You clench it when you're scared." "I'm not scared." "Yes, you are," he replied. "You just hide it better than most people." She stared at him then, really stared, and for a moment, she didn't see the CEO. She saw the man, the one who spent his nights alone, who had built his empire but never let anyone inside it. "You're good at pretending you don't feel anything," she whispered. "That's because no one ever cared if I did." The words hung between them like fragile glass. Grace looked away, her heart pounding. She hadn't come here to fall for him. She knew that. But somewhere between the contracts, the public appearances, and the long nights in silence, something had already started to break. And neither of them were ready for what was coming. Chapter 1. The Paper Bride. The wedding was beautiful. Of course it was. It had been designed to be. The sun hung low over the city skyline, casting golden light across the rooftop terrace of the Caldwell Tower. Photographers lined the edge of the marble flooring, snapping shots of the carefully curated scene, white roses draped across towering crystal arches, a live quartet playing softly in the background, and two impossibly perfect figures standing before the gathered guests. Ethan Caldwell stood tall in his tailored black tuxedo, every detail precise, polished, controlled. And beside him, Grace Whitmore wore a gown she hadn't chosen, but fit her like it was stitched onto her skin. Layers of soft silk fell around her like liquid light, and the diamond necklace at her throat sparkled with quiet authority. She felt like a mannequin, dressed for display, a piece of the set. Their hands were linked, cold fingers wrapped around cold fingers. The officiant's voice blended into the hum of cameras clicking, drones buzzing quietly above them, and whispered commentary from the high society guests who filled the rooftop like beautiful statues. "Do you, Ethan Caldwell, take Grace Whitmore to be your lawfully wedded wife?" His answer came instantly, steady. "I do." The words tasted like business. When the question turned to her, Grace forced her lips to curve into something that resembled a smile. The contract flashed through her mind. 6 months, scheduled appearances, private obligations, public perfection. This wasn't love. This was survival. "I do." Applause followed, polite and practiced. There was no first kiss. That too had been discussed in the contract. Professional distance was part of the agreement. But Ethan leaned in slightly, just enough for the cameras, and whispered so only she could hear. "Smile, Grace." She did. Because she had to. The reception unfolded like something out of a luxury magazine spread. Glass walls reflected the Manhattan skyline as waiters glided across the marble with trays of champagne. Guests floated from one glittering conversation to the next. Powerful men shook Ethan's hand. Wealthy socialites eyed Grace with a mixture of curiosity and subtle disdain. She heard pieces of their whispers as she moved from one polite introduction to the next. "Isn't she from Queens? A waitress, I heard. A family nobody knows. He must be desperate to keep the company. Pretty, at least." She smiled through all of it, keeping her head high. She had known this would come. Ethan had warned her. Their marriage would be dissected, analyzed, doubted. It didn't matter. Her mother was safe. That's all that mattered. Across the room, Veronica Caldwell watched her like a hawk circling a wounded animal. Ethan's older sister, sharp as glass, beautiful in the way money polished people into diamonds. She approached when Grace was briefly alone, her heels clicking like gunshots on the marble floor. "Grace," Veronica purred, her red lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You do clean up better than I expected." Grace kept her tone polite. "Thank you, Veronica." Veronica's gaze dropped, scanning Grace from head to toe as if searching for flaws. I suppose we all do strange things for family, don't we? Ethan's always been practical. Grace smiled again. We all make sacrifices. Veronica leaned in closer, voice lowering to a poisonous whisper. Don't mistake this for real power, darling. You may have a ring, but you don't have his heart. Grace met her eyes without blinking. I'm not here for his heart. That earned a small, surprised laugh from Veronica. She straightened her posture, tilting her head. Well, at least you're honest. The rest of the evening blurred into a string of carefully rehearsed smiles, photo opportunities, and empty conversations with strangers whose names she couldn't remember. But Ethan? He remained distant, efficient, always close enough for appearances, but never close enough to feel real. When it was finally over, when the last guest left and the photographers packed up their equipment, they stood alone on the terrace. The city below was a sea of lights, cold, glittering, endless. Grace wrapped her arms around herself against the wind as Ethan slipped his phone into his pocket and turned toward her. Well done, he said softly. She let out a breath. Was I convincing enough for your board? You were perfect. His voice was neutral. There was no warmth behind the compliment. It was simply a transaction completed, a goal achieved. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Grace broke the silence first, her voice thinner than she wanted. Is this how it's going to be for 6 months? He looked at her then, not as the billionaire CEO, not as the man calculating every move, just as a man. And for the first time that evening, something flickered in his eyes. Something she couldn't quite name. I don't know, Ethan admitted. The vulnerability in those 3 words startled her more than any coldness ever could. Without another word, he turned and opened the glass doors that led back into the penthouse. She followed him inside, her heels clicking softly against the marble, echoing through the emptiness of their shared but separate new life. No vows, no love, only a contract. But somewhere, quietly, something had already started to shift. And neither of them were ready for it. Chapter 2: Strangers Under One Roof. The penthouse was too quiet. Even with the endless hum of the city below, the silence inside felt heavy, almost deliberate, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Grace stood just inside the doorway of what was now, legally, her home. The space stretched out in front of her like something from a design catalog. Towering ceilings, polished marble floors, walls of glass that reflected the Manhattan skyline like a painting no one could touch. Everything was pristine. Cold, untouched. A perfect cage. Ethan's voice broke through the silence as he gestured casually toward the curved staircase. Your room is upstairs, second door on the right. Separate bedrooms, she said softly. Not a question, just confirmation. Of course, he replied, without even glancing at her. For a man who'd just married a stranger, he carried no trace of awkwardness, no hesitation, like this was simply another transaction closed, another deal neatly folded into his empire. Grace followed the staircase, her suitcase wheels whispering against the marble. Her room, if she could even call it that, was larger than the apartment she'd grown up in. Soft cream walls, a bed that looked too perfect to sleep in, a walk-in closet filled with dresses she hadn't picked, shoes she couldn't afford, jewelry she had. Everything had been chosen for her. The closet was full, but her life still felt empty. Later that evening, they sat at opposite ends of a dining table built for 10, separated by a distance that somehow felt bigger than the room itself. The dinner had been delivered by his private chef, perfectly plated, perfectly seasoned, perfectly tasteless. Grace poked at the seared salmon, listening to the quiet clink of cutlery. This is weird, she said finally, her voice breaking the heavy silence. Ethan didn't look up. It's dinner. No, she sighed, setting her fork down. It's a hostage negotiation with forks. He glanced up then. The faintest flicker of amusement crossed his face. Do you always talk like this? Only when I feel like I'm losing my mind. For a moment there was something there. Not warmth, not yet, but something less cold than before. You'll get used to it, he said, returning to his meal. Will I? She whispered, more to herself than to him. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The bed was too soft, the air too still. She missed the faint rumble of the city streets, the neighbor's dog that used to bark at nothing, the sound of her mother's soft breathing from the next room. Here, there was only silence and distance. At 2:13 a.m., Grace gave up. She pulled on her robe and padded barefoot downstairs, her steps muffled by the plush carpet. She wasn't sure why she went to the living room. Maybe she just wanted to feel less alone. That's when she saw him. Ethan sat on the couch in the dark, the soft glow of his laptop casting faint shadows across his sharp features. His tie was gone, his sleeves rolled up, his eyes focused on whatever numbers or contracts were dancing across his screen. "You're working," she said softly, surprised by her own voice. He looked up, not startled. "You're awake." Hard to sleep when the silence feels heavier than the sheets. His lips twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "I didn't think you'd want company." "I don't," she replied, sitting across from him, "but I don't want to feel like a ghost either." He closed his laptop, leaning back into the couch, watching her, studying her. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, he exhaled, voice low. "I don't know how to do this." "Be fake married?" she offered with a dry smile. "No," he said quietly. "Be close to someone who sees through me." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. Grace blinked, her chest tightening. "I don't need closeness, Ethan. I just need honesty." He nodded once, slowly, like her words settled somewhere deeper than he expected. Rising from the couch, he crossed the room to the liquor cabinet, poured a glass of scotch. Without asking, he poured a second one, handed it to her. They sat like that for a while, not talking, not pretending. Just existing in the same space for the first time without the script. When she finally rose to head back upstairs, she didn't slam the bedroom door like she had wanted to earlier. She closed it gently, because even if this wasn't love, even if this was only a contract, something had shifted. And she wasn't the only one who felt it. Chapter 3, The Balcony Confession. The gala sparkled like every other perfect event in Ethan Caldwell's world. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting soft golden light over the crowd. Guests floated through the ballroom like expensive perfume. Senators, CEOs, celebrities, each one more polished than the next. And in the center of it all, Ethan and Grace played their roles. Her dress shimmered under the lights, a deep emerald silk that clung to her figure, paired with diamond earrings that probably cost more than her old apartment. His hand rested lightly on the small of her back, a perfect picture of affection for the cameras watching them from every angle. But beneath the fabric, beneath the smiles, everything remained tense. Every glance, every polite nod, every forced laugh, it was all for show. As the night wore on, Grace excused herself, needing air. The weight of eyes on her, the whispered judgments behind champagne glasses, it all pressed against her ribs like a tight corset. She slipped out onto the balcony, the heavy doors clicking shut behind her. The city sprawled out before her in glittering silence, so close and yet so far away. She gripped the cold metal railing, breathing in the night air, finally able to exhale. Behind her, she heard his footsteps, always measured, always controlled. "You shouldn't wander off," Ethan said softly as he joined her. "People notice." "They've already noticed everything they want to notice," Grace replied, not looking at him. "Let them whisper." For a moment, neither spoke. The city hummed beneath them, alive and indifferent to the private war waging inside both their chests. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "You hate this," he said quietly. Grace's jaw tightened. "I hate pretending." "That was part of the agreement?" "I know." Her voice trembled slightly. "But I didn't realize pretending would feel so lonely." He turned to her, his face unreadable in the moonlight. "Is that what this is for you? Loneliness?" She let out a bitter breath. "Isn't it for you?" Ethan hesitated, and then for the first time since their wedding day, his guard slipped. "I never learned how to let people close," he admitted, his voice lower, softer than she had ever heard it. "When you learn early that love is a currency, you stop believing in debt you can't repay." Grace's chest tightened. She hadn't expected that, not from him. I'm not here to take anything from you, Ethan. He looked at her then, truly looked, and for the first time she saw not the billionaire CEO, not the man with iron walls built around his heart, but the boy who must have stood alone once, learning not to trust. I know, he whispered. The moment stretched between them like a fragile thread. Her voice softened. Why me? You were safe. His admission surprised even him. You were everything this situation needed, but you didn't come with expectations. You didn't ask for anything. And yet, Grace said, half laughing bitterly, I'm still standing here, pretending to be your wife. You're not pretending as well as you think, he said softly, almost to himself. Grace's breath caught. The words hung there, raw and dangerous. Ethan quickly looked away, as if afraid he'd said too much. The board needed a marriage, I needed control of the company, but somewhere along the way... He didn't finish. Grace took a careful step closer. Somewhere along the way... What? He met her eyes again, but this time the ice was cracking. I stopped knowing where the contract ended and where you started. The air shifted. The walls they both built so carefully were no longer sturdy. Not in this moment. Grace's heart pounded, but she whispered the truth anyway. You don't have to carry everything alone, Ethan. For the briefest of moments, she thought he might reach for her. But he didn't. Instead, he whispered, Go inside, Grace. His voice was steady again, cold again. The distance returned like a curtain falling. It's late. Her chest ached, but she obeyed. Because she understood now. He was more afraid of feeling than of falling apart. And for the first time, Grace realized this marriage wasn't a contract anymore. It was a war neither of them knew how to fight. Chapter 4. The Sister's Warning. The next morning, the city woke up early, as always. Grace sat at the long marble dining table, staring into the untouched cup of coffee in front of her. She heard Ethan's voice faintly from his office, calm, sharp, speaking in clipped sentences to someone on the phone. Business as usual. Except nothing felt usual anymore. The words he'd said last night still echoed in her chest. I stopped knowing where the contract ended and where you started. She traced the edge of the porcelain cup with her fingertip, her stomach twisting. She didn't know what scared her more, that he said it, or that a part of her wanted to believe him. The soft clicking of heels broke her thoughts. Grace didn't even need to turn around. Good morning, Veronica, she said softly. The older woman glided into the room like a shadow in designer silk, perfect as always. Her sleek hair framed her face like a weapon sharpened by years of privilege. Grace, Veronica smiled, though it was anything but warm. Enjoy in your little kingdom? Grace forced a polite smile, steadying her voice. It's not mine, it never was. Veronica's eyes narrowed slightly, studying her like a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. That's an interesting thing to say, considering the headlines. Grace stayed silent. She knew better than to rise to the bait. Veronica sat down across from her, folding her hands neatly, her diamond rings catching the morning light. Let's not waste time, she said, her voice smooth but edged with steel. I don't believe for 1 second that you're here for love, and neither does anyone else. Grace met her gaze, calm but unblinking. I never claimed to be. Veronica's lips curved into a thin smile. Of course not. You're smarter than that, which is precisely why I'm here. She leaned in, lowering her voice. You may think you've landed yourself a fairy tale, but I assure you, dear, you've walked into a battlefield. Grace's fingers curled slightly against her coffee cup. I know exactly what this is. No. Veronica shook her head, her voice soft, almost pitying. You know what you need this to be. You need it to be temporary, simple, a deal. But Ethan, he doesn't know how to do simple. Grace's breath caught for a moment, but she didn't let it show. Veronica's eyes sharpened. He's not a man who loves, not really. He was raised to control, Grace, to calculate. Love doesn't fit into his equation, not for you, not for anyone. Grace spoke carefully, her voice steady, but her heart pounding. Why are you telling me this, Veronica? Because when this ends, and it will end, I want you to remember that someone warned you. Her smile turned almost tender, which somehow made it feel colder. Don't confuse mercy for affection. He might be fascinated by you now, but eventually fascination fades, and when it does, you'll be left with nothing. Grace inhaled sharply, willing her hands not to shake. If that's meant to scare me, it won't. No, dear. Veronica stood, smoothing the silk of her blouse. That's not meant to scare you, that's meant to prepare you. She walked toward the door but paused at the threshold, glancing back one last time. Enjoy your contract, Grace. Just don't forget what you are. As the sound of her heels faded down the hallway, Grace sat frozen, her throat tightening. She didn't cry. Not now. Instead, she closed her eyes, breathing deeply, steadying herself against the rising storm inside her. Because as much as she wanted to believe Ethan's words from last night, Veronica was right about one thing. Fascination was never meant to last. Chapter 5. The illness that changed everything. The phone call came just after midnight. Grace had been lying awake, staring at the ceiling of her oversized bedroom when the vibration hummed against the nightstand. Her chest tightened before she even reached for it. No one called this late unless it was bad. When she saw the hospital's name flash across the screen, her stomach dropped. Hello? Her voice broke the moment she spoke. Miss Whitmore, this is St. Mary's. It's your mother. The words blurred after that. Low blood pressure, breathing complications, collapse. We've stabilized her for now, but you should come. Grace didn't even change out of her robe. She grabbed her keys and ran, her heart racing faster than her feet could carry her. But before she could reach the front door, she nearly crashed into Ethan. He stood there, fully dressed as if he hadn't slept. His eyes scanned her, instantly reading the panic. What's wrong? My mom? Grace barely got the words out. The hospital called, she collapsed. I'll drive. There was no hesitation in his voice, no questions, no cold distance, just 4 words. I'll drive. The black car sliced through the empty Manhattan streets like a ghost, the city lights blurring past. Ethan's hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles pale. For once, neither of them said anything. Words would have felt too small for the weight pressing on her chest. When they arrived, Grace bolted from the car and raced through the hospital doors. Ethan was right behind her, silent but present. A nurse led them down a quiet hallway. Machines beeped faintly in the distance like a ticking clock counting something down. When they finally reached her mother's room, Grace paused at the doorway, swallowing the lump in her throat before stepping inside. Her mother looked smaller somehow, frailer. The woman who raised her, who worked overtime shifts, who skipped meals so Grace wouldn't have to, was lying there beneath pale sheets, tubes, and wires surrounding her. Grace whispered her name, voice cracking. Mom. Her mother's eyes fluttered open, weakly. Sweetheart. Her voice was barely more than a breath. Tears slipped down Grace's cheeks before she could stop them. She took her mother's hand gently, afraid that even touching her too hard would cause her to break. I'm here, Grace whispered. I'm right here. Behind her, she felt Ethan stop at the doorway, giving her space, but not leaving. He stayed there, quiet, respectful, watching. Later, after the nurses finished checking vitals and her mother drifted back into sleep, Grace stepped into the hallway. Her legs shook beneath her. Ethan was waiting. Without a word, she collapsed against him. He caught her instantly. Strong arms wrapped around her trembling frame, pulling her close to his chest. His warmth seeped through her thin robe, steadying her in a way she didn't know she needed. Her voice was muffled against him. I can't lose her. You won't. His voice was low, steady. Not if I can help it. The promise in his words was not part of any contract. It wasn't business. It was something else entirely. They stood like that for a long time in the middle of the sterile hallway. No cameras, no board members, no staged appearances, just Ethan and Grace. When the doctor finally approached, Ethan released her gently but stayed by her side, his hand finding hers and squeezing it once. Firm, reassuring. The worst has passed, the doctor said softly. She's stable, but she's going to need closer care moving forward. Private care, preferably. Grace blinked back, tears, nodding. Okay? Okay. Ethan didn't hesitate. Arrange for it. Whatever she needs. Private nurse, top cardiologist, home equipment. Send the bills to my office. The doctor glanced between them, confused, but nodded. Of course. Grace looked up at him, stunned. You don't have to. Yes, I do. The way he said it made her throat tighten. There was no pride in his voice, no display of power, only quiet certainty. Later that morning, as the first pale light of dawn seeped through the hospital windows, Ethan returned from speaking with the doctor's team. Grace sat curled in one of the visitor chairs, exhaustion pulling at her bones. He handed her a fresh coffee, real coffee, not from the vending machine. She took it with both hands, whispering, "Thank you." "You're allowed to lean on someone, you know," Ethan said gently. "I'm not good at that." "Neither am I." Their eyes met then, and for the first time since their strange marriage began, there was no wall between them. "I don't understand you," Grace whispered. "Sometimes you're cold, like I don't even exist, and then other times, like this, you're—" She shook her head, searching for words. "You're someone else." Ethan's voice was quiet, almost raw. "Both are me. Which one is real?" He exhaled slowly. "I'm still figuring that out." Grace bit her lip, feeling her heart slide dangerously close to something she shouldn't feel. She looked down at her coffee cup, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Thank you for being here." Ethan stared at her for a moment, his gaze softer than ever before. "I told you, Grace, you don't have to do this alone." For the first time, she allowed herself to believe him, even if it terrified her. Chapter 6. The kiss that shouldn't have happened. The rain started as a quiet whisper against the penthouse windows, building steadily into a steady downpour that wrapped the city in gray. The storm rolled in without warning that night, violent, loud, and oddly fitting. Grace stood by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass like tears she wouldn't allow herself to cry. The last few days had blurred together. Hospital visits, meetings with doctors, long conversations about home care and specialists. Her mother was stable, but the fear still clung to her like a second skin. And through it all, Ethan had been there. Quiet, solid, constant. Tonight, though, the silence between them felt heavier. Behind her, she heard him enter the room. His presence was always silent, but she sensed him instantly. She turned slightly, meeting his gaze across the dimly lit living room. He looked tired. Not the usual kind of exhaustion that came from board meetings or power struggles, but something deeper, something raw. "You should get some rest," Ethan said gently. Grace gave a small, hollow laugh. "Sleep feels pointless these days." He stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away. The storm outside rumbled, lightning flashing across his sharp features, softening him in ways she rarely saw. "Grace," his voice lowered, "you've barely eaten. You can't keep running on empty." "I'm fine," she whispered, even though she wasn't. "No," he said quietly. The words hung between them, heavy and intimate. She stared up at him, her voice breaking. "I'm trying so hard to hold everything together, Ethan. My mom, this contract, you." The last word slipped out before she could stop it. His eyes darkened, something shifting behind them. "You don't have to hold me together," he said softly. "That's not your job." "Isn't it?" she breathed. "This entire arrangement is about control, Ethan, about your company, your reputation. I'm just—" Her voice cracked. "I'm just a piece of it." He took another step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the space between them. "You think that's all you are to me?" His voice was quiet but sharp. Grace opened her mouth to respond but found no words. "You have no idea," Ethan whispered. The storm cracked outside, thunder shaking the windows as the air thickened between them. And then he closed the final distance. Before Grace could think, before she could retreat, his hand slid gently along her jaw, tilting her face up to his. His thumb brushed her cheek like he was memorizing her. For a moment she froze, and then his lips met hers. It wasn't careful. It wasn't rehearsed. It was desperate. The kind of kiss that shouldn't have happened. His mouth captured hers with a heat that stole her breath, as though every ounce of restraint he'd carried for months shattered in an instant. She responded before her mind could catch up, leaning into him, fingers gripping his shirt as if afraid he might pull away. But he didn't. The kiss deepened, pulling something wild and dangerous to the surface. For a moment there were no contracts, no boardrooms, no cameras. Only them. Only the pounding of two hearts that had been held prisoner far too long. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathless, Grace's eyes searched his face. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered. His forehead rested gently against hers. "I know." They stood there for what felt like hours, hearts still racing, bodies still tangled in the quiet storm of what they had just allowed to break free. Finally, Ethan pulled back slightly, his voice rough. "Go to bed, Grace." The words felt heavier this time, not cold, not distant, protective. Afraid. Afraid of what they had started. Grace nodded slowly, her voice barely audible. "Good night, Ethan." And as she turned and walked away, both of them knew the truth. The contract was still in place, but the lines between them had already blurred beyond repair. Chapter 7. The Leak. The morning after the kiss felt heavier than any night before. Grace sat at the breakfast table, her fingers wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt his hands, his lips, his breath, all of it playing on a loop that left her chest tight and her thoughts tangled. Ethan entered the room like nothing had happened. Composed, measured, controlled. The only sign that something had shifted between them was the way his eyes flickered when they met hers, as if he too was walking carefully along a very thin line. Neither of them spoke of it, and maybe that was safer. The unspoken sat between them like a guest neither had invited but couldn't ask to leave. But that fragile balance didn't last long. It was late that afternoon when everything began to unravel. The first sign came with the sharp knock on Ethan's office door. His assistant, Lauren, peeked her head in, her face pale. "Sir," she said, her voice tight, "you need to see this." Ethan's jaw stiffened as he took the tablet from her hand, his eyes narrowed as he read the headlines spreading like wildfire across every major business outlet and gossip site. Caldwell's CEO's secret marriage, contract wife exposed. There were photos, paparazzi shots of him and Grace at events, leaked documents showing marriage agreements, and worst of all, accusations. Fraud, manipulation, a marriage staged for financial gain. Grace stood frozen in the doorway, her breath catching as she saw the headlines flash across the tablet in Ethan's hands. Her name was everywhere, on every article, every blog, every whispering mouth online. "Ethan?" she barely managed, her voice shaking. "How did they—" His face was hard, cold, like the man she had first met. "Someone leaked it," he said quietly, his voice controlled but razor-sharp. "Someone who wanted this exposed." Her stomach twisted. "Your sister!" His silence was confirmation enough. The phone started ringing almost immediately. Lawyers, board members, reporters. A media storm that neither of them were prepared for. Grace's heart pounded. She could feel the walls closing in fast. "This was never supposed to be public," she whispered. "I know." She stared at him, panic rising. "They're calling me a fraud, a gold digger." "You're not," he said instantly, his voice firm. "But that doesn't matter, does it?" Her voice cracked. "It's what they'll believe." For the first time in days, Ethan walked around the desk and stood in front of her. His hands hovered for a moment, as if unsure whether he still had permission to touch her, but then dropped to his sides. "I will handle this," he said quietly. "The board, the media, all of it." "But how?" she asked, voice trembling. "They'll crucify me. They already are." For a long moment, Ethan said nothing, and in that silence, Grace saw something flicker behind his eyes, something she hadn't seen before. Fear. Not for himself. For her. "You shouldn't have to suffer for this," he finally whispered. Grace felt her chest tighten. "Ethan, we both knew this was a risk." "No." His voice dropped lower. "I knew. I pulled you into this. You signed a contract to protect your mother. You didn't ask for this life." Tears burned her eyes, but she forced herself to breathe. It doesn't matter whose fault it is. What matters is how we survive it. Ethan exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening again. There are people who want me out of this company, Grace. People who will use you to get to me. They'll paint you as the schemer, the manipulator, the girl from Queens who trapped a billionaire. That's not true. I know, he repeated, softer this time. But truth doesn't always win first. Grace's hands trembled. So, what happens now? He hesitated, and that hesitation frightened her more than anything. Finally, his voice broke through, heavy and resigned. I'll find a way to shield you. Even if that means... He didn't finish, but she understood. Even if that means ending this. Even if that means walking away. The thought sliced through her like glass. She opened her mouth to protest, but the door burst open before she could speak. Veronica stood there, calm and victorious, holding her own copy of the leaked headlines. Well, she said sweetly, it seems the truth always finds its way to the surface, doesn't it? Ethan's eyes went dark. Get out. Oh, Ethan, she sighed, pretending disappointment. I'm only here to offer advice. After all, the board is already calling for an emergency meeting. The press is waiting downstairs. You can't hide this anymore. Her gaze shifted to Grace, her smile sharpening. Poor girl. I tried to warn you, didn't I? Grace stood stiff, breathing through the tightness in her throat, refusing to break in front of her. You wanted this, Ethan snapped. You wanted her destroyed. Veronica's expression cooled. No, little brother, I wanted you destroyed. She's just collateral damage. The room pulsed with unspoken violence. Grace finally found her voice, quiet but steady. You won't win, Veronica. The older woman chuckled, turning to leave. Oh, sweet girl, you still think this is about winning. As the door closed behind her, silence filled the room again. Grace and Ethan stood there, both knowing that whatever fragile safety they'd built had shattered. The contract had protected them once. Now it was tearing them apart. Chapter 8. The Public Stand. The boardroom was packed. Faces that once smiled politely now wore sharp, unreadable masks. The weight of wealth and reputation pulsed through the room like static electricity. Ethan Caldwell stood at the head of the long mahogany table, perfectly still, while the board members whispered among themselves. The leaked scandal had ignited a firestorm. On the far end of the room sat Veronica, calm, composed, and waiting. She didn't need to speak. Her smug silence was loud enough. Ethan's eyes swept across the room. The men who once envied his rise now smelled blood. Investors, advisors, longtime partners, they all saw an opportunity. This isn't personal, Ethan, one of the older board members said carefully, breaking the tense silence. But the press is relentless. The shareholders are worried. The company's stability is at risk. You mean your stability? Ethan replied, his voice even, sharp as glass. Let's not pretend otherwise. The scandal makes you vulnerable, another chimed in. You can't protect the company if you're too busy defending your personal life in tabloids. Veronica finally spoke, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Perhaps it's time you step aside, brother, for the good of Caldwell Holdings. Ethan said nothing, because outside this room, far beyond these walls, Grace was sitting alone in the penthouse, drowning under the storm that these people had created. They had turned her into a headline, a target. They had no idea who she really was. And for the first time in his carefully controlled life, Ethan realized he didn't care about control anymore. He cared about her. Slowly, Ethan set down his pen, standing taller. You're all right about one thing, he said, voice calm but cutting. This company is my responsibility, but let's be clear, this has nothing to do with Grace. The room stiffened. She signed nothing she didn't fully understand. She married me under a contract we both agreed to, but while you sit here judging her, I'll remind you, she never asked for this life. I dragged her into it. Veronica raised a brow. Ethan! He cut her off sharply. No, you'll let me finish. The authority in his voice silenced even her. Ethan looked around the table, locking eyes with each board member. You want to remove me? Fine, do it. Call your vote. But I will not allow you to smear an innocent woman simply because you're too weak to face public discomfort. The tension thickened. You want to sacrifice her to protect your image. I won't." He paused, breathing slowly, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. "If keeping my position means standing by while you drag Grace through the mud, then I resign." A ripple moved through the room. Shock. Disbelief. "I won't give you my wife to save my title." The words landed like a slap across Veronica's perfect face. She recovered quickly, leaning forward. "How noble of you," she hissed. "But don't think for a second they'll vote to keep you now." Ethan smiled, a small, dangerous curve of his lips. "That's where you're wrong." At that moment, Mr. Jennings, one of the oldest board members, cleared his throat. "I've watched you for years, Ethan," Jennings said, folding his hands calmly. "And for the first time today, I finally believe you're ready to lead this company." A murmur swept through the room. "Leadership isn't about protecting your pride, it's about protecting those who stand behind you. Today you showed us who you are. Not just a CEO. Jennings glanced around the table. "And I'm not alone." One by one, several other board members nodded, breaking the fragile alliance Veronica had tried to build. The tide shifted. Veronica's mask cracked for the first time. She leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing, her victory slipping through her perfectly manicured fingers. The vote was called, and Ethan stayed. But none of it mattered to him anymore. Not really. Because while the boardroom erupted into quiet debates and closing statements, Ethan's mind was already somewhere else. With her. He left the building before the final signatures were dry, stepping into his car and ordering the driver home. The penthouse was quiet when he arrived. Grace sat curled up on the couch, staring out at the rain beyond the glass, her reflection faint in the window. When she heard the door, she turned quickly. Her eyes were red. Tired. "I saw the headlines," she whispered. "I heard what they're saying." He crossed the room in 3 long steps, kneeling in front of her, his voice breaking for the first time in months. "None of it matters." Tears filled her eyes. "You could have lost everything because of me. I'd lose it all 1,000 times for you." His hands found hers, pulling them gently into his lap. "The board wanted me to sacrifice you," he whispered. "I wouldn't. I never will." Grace's breath hitched, her voice trembling. "Why, Ethan?" His thumb brushed the tear from her cheek, his voice raw and honest. "Because somewhere along the way I stopped pretending. The contract had ended in that moment. Whatever came next was real." Chapter 9. The Boardroom Betrayal. For a brief moment there was peace. The storm outside had finally passed. The tabloids moved on. The media found new scandals to devour. The world, as it always does, turned to something shinier. But inside the walls of Caldwell Holdings, the true storm was just beginning. Ethan stood at the head of the table once again. Same room, same board members, but this time, something was different. The knives weren't hiding anymore. Veronica sat on the opposite side, poised like a queen, preparing for checkmate. But this wasn't about public perception now. This was war from within. She leaned forward, voice sweet but sharpened like a dagger. "You've survived the media circus, little brother. I'll give you that. But you forgot one thing. This company isn't held together by sympathy or love stories. It's held by contracts, clauses, and controlling interests." Ethan didn't flinch. Jennings, loyal but cautious, spoke up. "Veronica, enough of these games. You've tried to push him out once already." She smiled at Jennings as though humoring an old man. "This isn't personal, gentlemen. This is fiduciary responsibility." Her gaze shifted back to Ethan. "And according to the bylaws, should any conflicts of interest or legal improprieties arise regarding the CEO's judgment, particularly if connected to personal relationships, the board may call for immediate review." Ethan's jaw flexed. It was always about Grace. Veronica continued. "Shall I remind the board that our CEO entered into a contractual marriage? A marriage originally designed to secure this very company?" She let that hang in the air like smoke. "Whether or not love eventually blossomed is irrelevant. His original intent constitutes a breach of ethical conduct." The room shifted uncomfortably. Ethan spoke, voice low but firm. "You're reaching." Veronica smiled wider, her words like silk wrapping around poison. "Am I? Or am I simply pointing out that your personal arrangements may leave this company exposed to future litigation, investor withdrawal, and shareholder instability. She turned to the others, voice steady. "We've weathered one storm, gentlemen. How many more can we afford before Caldwell Holdings becomes another cautionary tale?" Silence fell. Ethan felt the weight of it settle over his shoulders. He glanced briefly at Jennings, who now looked torn, and at the others, who began to whisper among themselves. The momentum was slipping. He could feel it. In that moment, the door to the boardroom opened, and everything stopped. Grace stepped inside. Every head turned. Her presence sucked the air from the room. She wore no expensive jewelry, no designer gown, just a simple black dress. Elegant, understated. But it was her quiet strength that filled the space. Veronica's smile faltered for the first time. Ethan stood. "Grace, you shouldn't be." She raised a hand gently. "No, I need to speak." Her voice was soft but carried, steady as stone. She turned to the board, her eyes clear. "I know what you think of me. I've read the headlines, heard the whispers. I was never supposed to be here, and honestly, I never wanted to be." She paused, breathing in. "But I love him." A ripple moved through the room. Her voice never wavered. "Not because of his money, not because of his name. I love him because when my mother collapsed, he stood by me. Because when the world ripped me apart, he protected me. Because when he could have chosen his company over me, he didn't." She looked directly at Veronica now. "You think love makes him weak, but it's made him stronger than any of you will ever be." Veronica scoffed, her tone acidic. "This isn't about love, dear. This is about business." Grace didn't blink. "Then maybe this company deserves a leader who finally understands both." For the first time, some of the board members nodded subtly, their doubt shifting. Veronica's eyes narrowed. "You think your little speech changes anything?" Jennings spoke next, his voice calm, deliberate. "It changes everything, Veronica." He turned toward the board. "We've let ambition blind us to the one thing that's always been missing at this table: integrity." Another vote was called, and this time the outcome wasn't even close. Ethan stayed. Veronica's grip on the company slipped through her manicured fingers like sand. As the meeting adjourned, Grace stood silently at Ethan's side. The board members filed out one by one, some offering small nods of quiet respect as they passed. Veronica was the last to leave. She paused in front of Ethan, her voice a bitter whisper. "You won't survive this second chance." Ethan met her gaze, calm, steady. "You'll fall, knowing I protected what mattered." She left without another word. When the room finally emptied, Ethan turned to Grace, his voice breaking for the first time that day. "You didn't have to come." Her eyes filled, but her voice was soft, steady. "Yes, I did." He pulled her into his arms, not as a performance, not for anyone else, but because, finally, there was nothing left to hide. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Chapter 10. No more contracts. The city glittered below them, its lights stretching endlessly into the night. The rooftop terrace was quiet now. No cameras, no flashing bulbs, no audience. Just the soft breeze, the hum of distant traffic, and the two of them standing side by side. For the first time since it all began, there was nothing left to perform, no lies left to uphold. Just truth. Grace watched Ethan as he stood at the edge, his hands resting on the glass railing, staring out at the skyline that had once defined everything he was. The crowd multiplied. "This was always my world," he said softly, his voice almost carried away by the wind. "This city, this company, this fight for control. It's all I ever knew." She stepped closer, her voice gentle. "And now?" He turned to her, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. "Now it feels smaller." He paused, breathing in deeply. "I spent years building walls around me, Grace. Contracts, deals, boundaries. I thought if I could control everything, I'd never get hurt. But you..." His voice broke slightly. "You terrified me. Because you were never part of the plan." She smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "I didn't plan on you either." Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a familiar folder. The original contract they had both signed. The paper that started it all. He opened it slowly, his fingers running over the black and white text like it was some ancient relic from a life that no longer belonged to them. "This contract saved me once," he whispered. "But it's not who we are anymore." Without hesitation, he tore the papers in half. And then again, the pages fluttered like feathers in the wind, carried away into the night sky above Manhattan. "No more contracts," he said softly, his voice full. "No more rules. No more pretending." Tears slipped down Grace's cheeks as she whispered, "Then what now?" Ethan stepped forward, closing the space between them, his hands finding her waist, his eyes never leaving hers. "Now I ask you, not as a CEO, not as a man running from fear, but as someone who finally knows what he wants." He reached into his pocket again, but this time pulled out a small velvet box. Simple, no fanfare, no audience. Just them. Opening it slowly, he revealed a ring, delicate, timeless, and breathtaking in its simplicity. "Grace Whitmore," his voice trembled for the first time in months, "will you marry me again? No contracts, no business, just us." Her breath caught. She had dreamed of this moment and feared it in equal measure, because this time it was real, and real was always scarier than pretend. But it was also the only thing worth saying yes to. She smiled through her tears, her voice shaking. "Yes, Ethan, 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and as their lips met, the city roared beneath them. Alive, endless, but for once, distant. Because all that mattered now was right there, in the quiet space between two people who had once been strangers under contract and now stood together, freely, with nothing left but love. If you ask Grace, she'll tell you it was never about the contract. Not really. Because long after the papers were signed and destroyed, after the scandals passed, after the cameras faded, what remained was something neither of them had ever planned for. Real love. A kind of love that didn't arrive with promises or grand speeches. A kind of love that grew in silent rooms, stolen glances, and whispered confessions. Ethan Caldwell, the man who once believed control was safer than connection, learned something in those months that would stay with him for the rest of his life. That love cannot be negotiated. It can't be scheduled, signed, or controlled. It demands risk. It demands surrender. And sometimes, it demands breaking before it heals. Their life today looks nothing like the beginning. The company survived, the empire remained, but those things no longer defined him. Now it's the quiet mornings with coffee she makes too strong. The way her laughter still softens the edges of his worst days. The feeling of her fingers lacing through his when the world feels too loud. The way she whispers his name, not because she needs anything from him, but simply because she loves him. And the man who once swore he'd never trust anyone again finds himself trusting her with everything, every single day. Sometimes, life gives us exactly what we never thought we wanted. Sometimes, the greatest kind of love comes after the contract ends. If you've ever loved or hoped to be loved like this, may this story remind you, real love doesn't happen when you're ready. It happens when you're willing.